To Deuteronomy chapter 25. That's where we're going to be focusing our attention this morning. When I was a kid, my brother and I, we had this little tape recorder that we got for Christmas one year. And we used to sit in our bedroom on the weekends when we didn't have anything to do, you know, when you tell your mom again and again that you're bored. And she says, I don't care, find something to do. So we'd get that tape recorder out, and we would record ourselves doing like talk shows and even like recording like commercials and stuff. Sometimes it would be sports, sometimes it would be news, that sort of thing. And we never thought much about it, but apparently you can do that now, and they call it podcasting, and it's all over the place, and everybody loves it. And everybody thinks they have a career as a podcaster. So there's, you know, I don't know how many hundreds of thousands of podcasts out there are now. It probably grows exponentially on a daily basis. But there was one podcast I was listening to a couple months ago, and it was a husband and wife who do this podcast focusing on things that is related to marriage and parenting, and I was listening to that, and they said something in that podcast that took me completely by surprise. So it really sort of blew me away. It was something I had never considered before in my life. They were talking about an important decision that they were going to have to make as a family. And one of the things that they said they did as a part of that whole decision-making process was they said, so we sort of wrote out the gist of what this decision was, and then we ran it through our family mission statement. And that just blew my mind. I had never heard of that before in my life, a family mission statement. I mean, I've heard of corporate mission statements. A lot of schools have a mission statement. Churches have mission statements. But a family mission statement, that was just crazy to me. I mean, in the best kind of way. I thought it was really good to sort of lay out before you have these significant decisions to make what is sort of the framework under which our family is going to operate. It's actually, I guess if you were to think, how would you go about making a family mission statement? What would be your source material? How would you, where would you look to sort of guide yourself? And I think as unusual as that is, and surprising as it was for me to hear it talked about, it's actually not really that hard, because the source material for a family mission statement is really the same source material as a church mission statement. Most churches that have a mission statement that take the Word of God seriously, they go to two places. They go to the Great Commission, and they go to the two Great Commandments. That source material for a church mission statement also happens to be what would be the source material for a family mission statement. Grace Fellowship, we have a mission statement. I probably don't talk about it as often as I should, but our mission statement is derived from the Great Commission and the two Great Commandments, and it is every member a minister, every person a ministry, everything for the glory of God. The idea is that the Great Commission is given to Jesus' disciples, and we are disciples. So we are all supposed to be ministers of his gospel to the world, and we are supposed to go to every tribe, tongue, and nation, so every person is supposed to be regarded as a ministry opportunity, and we do all things for the glory of God. The Great Commission was Christ's charge to his disciples. We are his disciples. And the Great Commandment, Jesus says, the Great Commandment and the second greatest commandment sums up all the law and the prophets. And this is very relevant for our study of Deuteronomy, because in Deuteronomy, we have Moses sort of expanding on the Ten Commandments and explaining the Ten Commandments. And then in the New Testament, in Matthew chapter 22, or in the Sermon on the Mount, we have Jesus compressing the Ten Commandments down into two. So, what I want you to do as I read Deuteronomy chapter 25, while I'm reading it, I want you to see if you could answer this question. How would this, that is, how would Deuteronomy chapter 25 help the Israelites better love Yahweh their God with all their heart, soul, and mind, and love their neighbors as themselves? How would this chapter help them do that if they were to be obedient to it? Let's read it here. If there is a dispute between men and they come into court and the judges decide between them, acquitting the innocent and condemning the guilty, then if the guilty man deserves to be beaten, the judge shall cause him to lie down and be beaten in his presence with a number of stripes in proportion to his offense. 40 stripes may be given, but not more, lest if one should go on to beat him more than these, your brother be degraded in your sight. You shall not muzzle an ox when it is treading out grain. If brothers dwell together and one of them dies and has no son, the wife of the dead man shall not be married outside the family to a stranger. Her husband's brother shall go in to her and take her as his wife and perform the duty of a husband's brother to her, and the first son whom she bears shall succeed to the name of his dead brother, that his name may not be blotted out of Israel. And if the man does not wish to take his brother's wife, then his brother's wife shall go up to the gate of the elders and say, my husband's brother refuses to perpetuate his brother's name in Israel. He will not perform the duty of a husband's brother to me. Then the elders of his city shall call him and speak to him, and if he persists, saying, I do not wish to take her, then the brother's wife shall go up to him in the presence of the elders and shall pull his sandal off his foot and spit in his face. And she shall answer and say, so shall it be done to the man who does not build up his brother's house. And the name of his house shall be called in Israel, the house of him who has his sandal pulled off. When men fight with one another, and the wife of the one draws near to rescue her husband from the hand of him who is beating him, and puts her hand and seizes him by the private parts, then you shall cut off her hand. Your eye shall have no pity. You shall not have in your bag 2 kinds of weights, a large and a small. You shall not have in your house 2 kinds of measures, a large and a small. A full and fair weight you shall have, a full and fair measure you shall have, that your days may be long in the land that the Lord your God is giving you. For all who do such things, all who act dishonestly, are an abomination to the Lord your God. Remember what Amalek did to you on the way as you came out of Egypt, how he attacked you on the way when you were faint and weary, and cut off your tail, those who were lagging behind you. He did not fear God. Therefore, when the Lord your God has given you the rest from all your enemies around you, in the land that the Lord your God is giving you for an inheritance to possess, you shall blot out the memory of Amalek from under heaven. You shall not forget. So what do you think? How does that help us love the Lord our God with all our heart, soul, mind, and strength, and love our neighbors as ourselves? It's a bit of a challenge, isn't it? But Jesus said all the law and all the prophets can be summed up in these 2 commandments. So in some way, this is meant to help God's people better love him and better love their neighbors. And what I think this chapter shows, as does so many of the chapters of Deuteronomy, it gets to the idea of motivations. Why do we do what we do? How are we to understand how we're supposed to live in light of what God has done for us? And so we have in this chapter 3 different motivations for how we should act towards one another, or how God's people, as he was preparing to bring them into the promised land, were supposed to act towards one another. Then we can also draw from this and get ideas, hopefully, about how we can love our neighbors as ourselves through selfless sacrifice. So the first motivation is we sacrifice of ourselves to meet other people's needs. To meet other people's needs. I'm not going to take this chapter in order, kind of like I did last week. I'm going to do it the same way. So look at verses 5 through 10. This is probably the most confusing part of the chapter for you if you read it. It's this whole idea of what's called levirate marriage. It's only prescribed here in the Old Testament. It is described in Genesis chapter 38 in the account of Judah and Tamar. This comes right after sort of Joseph's being sold into slavery. Genesis 38. The circumstance that happened there, and well, one of the reasons it's important to understand that it's in Genesis 38 is to know that this was a common practice long before Deuteronomy was ever written. Judah had some sons, and then his eldest son had a wife named Tamar, but his eldest son was wicked. And so in Genesis 38, it says that God killed him because of his wickedness. And so his next son was supposed to go into his wife and perform this levirate marriage, but he was also wicked, so he died. And then the son after that went in, and he refused to give her this son that was due her. And so God declared that act to be wicked. And then, so he was killed. So she's got no children, no husband. And then Judah had another son. So if you remember the Sadducees' account of this wife who ended up being married to 7 different brothers, it's very much sort of looking like it's tracking along those same lines. This is now going to be brother number 4, potentially. And Judah said, well, he's too young for you. We got to wait, let him grow up a little bit. The end of the story, essentially, she ends up entrapping him, and when all is said and done, he realizes that what he had done by not giving her this last son so that she could have her own children that would be under the name of her first husband, that what he had done was wicked. And then we have in Matthew, as I mentioned, and as Chaz read, this story of levirate marriage. So it was still apparently going on to some degree in the first century in Palestine. So it's something that was taking place for a long time. This was a common practice. What was the purpose of this regulation? Why did God see fit to put this into Deuteronomy as an instruction for his people about how they were supposed to support widows so that they could have sons in their husband's name? Well, first of all, it's important to realize that this is only something that took place when sort of all the stars were aligned. It was in a very specific set of circumstances had to line up in order for this to be the way they were supposed to engage in remarrying a widow. First of all, the brothers, it said, had to live together. So this would have been most likely some sort of multi-generational household where they were all sort of living in the same sort of compound of tents if they were still fairly nomadic. But they all lived together maybe under the authority of the father, kind of like the situation with Judah. So that had to be happening. And then the brother who was married to this particular woman, he had to die. So they had to be married, and then he had to die before they had a son. If he died after it, well, this is off. If there's no other brothers, this is off. If they don't live in the same vicinity, this is off. So then, only then, if all of those circumstances were met, then if there was a living brother who was not himself married, then he would take the widow into his family as his wife. And then the first son, and only the first son, would be regarded as the son of the deceased brother. That's the limiting factors, the conditions under which this was supposed to take place. And what's so interesting, too, if you look at Deuteronomy chapter 25, is it's not so much about inheritance. So many people would say, well, this is about giving this widow a source of income and providing for her. No doubt that was something that happened, but the primary reason behind this, what Moses says, is that this was to preserve the brother's name, to preserve that first brother's legacy, to give him a son so that his family name would go on. This was a sacrifice. This was a sacrifice for that second brother or third brother, whichever brother ended up being the one who was obligated to marry this widow. The Genesis 38 account makes this clear because Onan, the brother who initially was married to Tamar but refused to give her a son, his reason for behind doing that was because he realized he wouldn't gain anything from it. If anything, it cost him. It cost him to support this woman and then to support this son who would not be his own son. It was a sacrifice, and so he said, I'm not going to make that sacrifice. It's not worth it to me. And that's what God judged to be wicked. Similarly, in Deuteronomy chapter 25, as Moses is explaining this, you can clearly see that if the son refused to do this, it was not illegal. He wasn't going to be subject to punishment like is described earlier in the chapter. There's not he's not taken before a judge and there's no sort of criminal charge brought against him. Rather, it becomes a mark on his reputation. His name and his family name carries this scar on it. And many scholars think that what this would have done for his family, if he refused this, would have made his daughters difficult to marry. Because what he was saying is, I'm not going to support this, and so in all likelihood, his sons would not be made to support this as well. So if you marry into that family, you're taking a risk. That was ultimately what would have been the mark against their family, as he would have been known as the house of him who has his sandal pulled off. It was a matter of reputation that would have been marred. So, the whole purpose of this was a matter of loving your neighbor. In this case, loving your sister-in-law, making a sacrifice for her so that you could honor your brother's legacy and preserve it. Everybody wonders with these kind of laws, well, why don't we do that anymore? If it was so good back then, why don't we do it anymore? And you have to understand under the Mosaic law, under the Old Testament law, there's really three different categories of laws. There's moral laws, there are civil laws, and there are ceremonial laws. Moral laws are universal for all times. There are things like thou shalt not kill. There's never going to be a time when that goes away and you can just rain down terror on your neighborhood. That's never going to happen. The civil laws were in place when God or his appointed ruler was in place and Israel was a nation. Those civil laws would be in place. And then ceremonial laws had to do with the formal worship of God as is described in the Old Testament. But when we come to the New Testament, yes, God is still on the throne, ruling over his creation, but as far as his people's civil authority, they're under Roman rule then. And so, for example, in 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verse 39, Paul says, a wife is bound to her husband as long as he lives, but if her husband dies, she is free to be married to whom she wishes, only in the Lord. He does not put any sort of restrictions about this whole idea of if brothers are living together and if there's a brother who's available, then she's got to marry him and he's got to marry her. That's not laid out there. So it was something that was in place for God's people while they were under, in this particular time, they're under what's called a theocracy. God is their ruler. They don't even have a king. But if that goes away and we're no longer bound to that civil law anymore, then even if I understand how this helped the people of Israel love their neighbors at that time, how does this help me know how I'm supposed to love my neighbor? Well, I think one way is it helps us to understand how we should value and treat widows. We still have widows, don't we? When you think of widow, you think of an elderly woman, don't you? This wasn't the case. This wasn't addressing elderly women. This law was addressing young women. They died before they had any children, and not because they were barren. It's because their husbands died when they were young. When we think about widows, and we tend to think of the elderly, and the way that we care for them tends to be in sort of that domain. We might assume that they already have their own elderly children, the adult children who can sort of come alongside them, and we just maybe need to supplement that because their kids live out of town or out of state or something like that, and we just need to be a support for them and a friend to them. But what about if it was a younger widow? In 1 Timothy chapter 5, verse 14, Paul does say, so I would have younger widows marry, bear children, manage their households, and give the adversary no occasion to slander. And when he gives that instruction, he's specifically making a distinction between how the church helps the elderly widows and how they should help the younger widows. Elderly, they come alongside them, they provide financial support, material support to them. But he did not want that to be the case with the younger widows, because then they would become idle. He talks about them being busybodies, and therefore being essentially opportunity for the devil to use them for wicked purposes rather than for good. And so it would be better for these younger widows if they would remarry and sort of re-engage into family life. But there are ways that we can support these younger widows as well. This helps us to understand maybe the extent to which we as believers should be willing to sacrifice of our own resources and our own comforts to help even these younger, able-bodied widows. It might not be something you've ever thought about before. When you read verses about things like pure religion and undefiled before God is this, to visit orphans and widows in their affliction. You might not ever think about younger widows. And yet here, all the way back in Deuteronomy, God gives a provision for his people to see that younger widows are cared for, and that their family name, the family name that they initially married into, is able to be preserved. So our first motivation that we learn in Deuteronomy chapter 25 as it regards how we are supposed to love our neighbors as ourselves is we are supposed to be willing to sacrifice our own agendas and our own comforts to meet others' needs. The next one is that our sacrifice is supposed to be motivated by integrity. Motivated by integrity. When I was in high school, I had a principal that integrity was his issue. I mean, he drilled that into us. It seemed like every assembly we had was somehow connected to helping us to understand the significance of living lives of integrity. And he used to always say that his sort of quick definition of integrity was doing right when no one's looking. That's how you know if you have integrity or not. Are you willing to do what's right even if nobody else is going to know? It relates to your character. Integrity comes out of your character, who you are as a person. And so there are some instructions here that get to the heart of integrity. One of them is in verse 13, that you're not supposed to have two different kinds of weights, and you're not supposed to have two different kinds of measures. In an economy that was based primarily on bartering, people would measure out what they were willing to trade. I'm going to trade you this many bushels of wheat for this many bushels of barley. And so if somebody had a different size bushel, they had a smaller one, and they're like, yeah, trust me, this is a bushel. It looks small, but it's not. Trust me, it's not small. It just looks that way from your perspective. But it's the same, trust me. But then when it was their friends and they had a different one that was bigger, the idea is you need to have integrity. Don't cheat people. In that sort of economy, standardized measures were important. And if you were dishonest by having more than one measure so that you could cheat people, so that you could get a better exchange rate, depending on who you were dealing with, then you were not living with integrity. Maybe you never would get caught. That's not the point. The issue should not even be up for debate, because you shouldn't even have these two separate weights and two separate measures to begin with. You should be operating with integrity right from the start. We have these little sayings in our lives. We say things like, no cop, no stop, or it's not speeding until you get the ticket, right? We have these little ways of sort of manipulating the laws to our favor, because who's going to know, right? Are you willing to do what's right even if nobody else will know? Don't have two separate weights. Don't muzzle the ox. Verse 4, when it's treading out grain. This is a matter of integrity. There's no OSHA or Bureau of Labor for oxen. There's no inspectors going to come around and check on how you're treating your animals. Nobody was going to do that. The only person who would hold you to it was you. The idea of not muzzling the ox while it treads out grain might be a little bit strange to us, because I would bet none of us have ox at home. And even if you do, I bet you don't use them to tread your grain. Probably use them for something else. But the idea is that you would use these ox to separate the grain from the chaff, and then you could collect that and bag it up, hopefully in one size measure, not in two different measures. But while they're working, you don't muzzle them, so if they get hungry, they can have a little snack. They can eat while they're working. The Apostle Paul makes it clear that this principle was not just for the ox. It's one of those things where it's from the lesser to the greater. If this is how you're supposed to treat your animals, then certainly this is how you treat people. And Paul uses it to advocate that the worker is worthy of his hire. But if somebody works, you make sure they get paid. And he applies that even to his own ministry and people working in ministry, that if even oxen were worthy of receiving some food as a payment for their work, then certainly those who labor for the gospel, that labor in spiritual domain, are worthy of being provided for as well. It was a matter of personal integrity, and it extended all the way down to how you treat your animals. The thing that was such a challenge, I think, when my high school principal was always sort of trying to advocate for integrity and teach integrity and model integrity and encourage integrity, is this: if you don't have integrity, how do you grow in integrity? If lack of integrity shows itself in the secret parts of your life, in the areas where you think nobody's going to know, it can be very challenging to, when you discover you lack integrity, to mature in that area. This is why lying is so hard to break, because the whole point of lying is trying to get away with something. It can be difficult to have any sort of accountability. So if you're not one who is motivated by integrity and you recognize it's a problem, how do you improve? I think one is you remember God's promises. For example, 2 Chronicles 16:9 says, "For the eyes of the Lord run to and fro throughout the earth, to give strong support to those whose heart is blameless towards him." Remember, God sees and he promises that he is going to support you in your integrity. I would read Proverbs again and again and again and learn the difference between living foolishly and living wisely. And when Solomon or the different individuals who wrote the Proverbs are talking about wisdom versus folly, foolishness is essentially a substitute for sinfulness. The foolishness of Proverbs is not just you're not using common sense. You're never going to get ahead in life that way. No, the foolishness in Proverbs is sinfulness. And the wisdom in Proverbs is righteousness. And learn to know the difference. Learn to know the value of walking in wisdom. Walking in wisdom means to walk with integrity. And then to get to the point of our message is to understand, how do these regulations in Deuteronomy chapter 25 help us to love God with all our heart, soul, and mind, and help us to love our neighbor as ourselves. I would make that connection. If you want to live with integrity, you cannot forget the first great command, to love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, and mind. And you have to start there, because you are never going to love your neighbor as yourself if you don't love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. You are not going to see the value of loving your neighbor. You're not going to see the value of treating him or her with integrity if you do not love the Lord your God with all your heart. And on the flip side, you can't say you love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, and mind if you do not love your neighbor. That's what a main theme in the book of 1 John. You can't say you love God if you don't love your brother. And we could draw that into Deuteronomy 25 and say, you can't say you love God if you don't live with integrity. You need to make a sacrifice to live with integrity. And then the last motivation is, you need to be willing to sacrifice of yourself to maintain other people's dignity. This ties in with the focus of Deuteronomy chapter 24. Conflict presents people with opportunity to love their neighbors as themselves. Many years ago, we kind of went through the Ken Sandy peacemaker stuff. And if you weren't around when we did that, maybe you're still familiar with that Peacemaker Ministries. But in his book on conflict resolution, his first two principles might seem counterintuitive. You have this conflict resolution. Principle number one that sort of gets drummed in his material is get the log out of your own eye first. And that's not a Ken Sandy principle, that's a Jesus principle. Get the log out of your own eye first, because then you're better able to help your brother or sister remove the splinter out of theirs. And then the second one is know how and when to overlook a fault. Sometimes the best thing is just to overlook something. When you do both of those, though, sometimes you still need conflict resolution. Yes, getting the log out of your own eye will help you first see your own faults, your own shortcomings, your own contributions to the problem, and that can relieve it right there. Yes, being willing to overlook certain faults, that can relieve the problem as well. But sometimes there needs to be further action to resolve conflicts. But resolution of those conflicts should never come at the expense of another person's dignity. We see this in Deuteronomy chapter 25. How can you maintain individuals' dignity in the midst of a conflict? And there are three examples in this chapter. We've got the first example, the beginning of the chapter, a dispute that requires a judge's ruling. Later on, you have just a straight up fight. There's a brawl going on, and fists are being thrown. And then the last one is you have the wicked killing of defenseless people. How do you respond to a conflict after the fact when it has been perpetrated 100% by a wicked individual or individuals? In the first scenario, there's a dispute between men and they come into a court and the judge decides between them. So there's this dispute. It requires a judge's ruling. So the first thing is a dispute that requires a judge's ruling. You don't try and settle it yourselves. You take it to the proper authority. As far as the judge's ruling, the punishment should fit the crime. This is one of the things he says here, that if there's the man deserves to be beaten, that it should be in proportion to his offense. There's supposed to be something going on here that deserves punishment. The punishment should fit the crime. And then when you do this, the punishment is not supposed to ever be so severe that it is degrading to the individual. No doubt being beaten in public is a humiliating experience. It was meant to be both punitive and preventative. The person is supposed to be an example to others of the wages of their sin. And that's meant to be a deterrent. But even with those realities in mind, it's never supposed to be that somebody is treated as less than a human. You don't treat them like a dog. You don't beat them like an animal. There is a limit to the extent to which you could punish them. It's supposed to be proportionate, and it's never supposed to get to the point of being degrading. The second scenario, maybe even stranger to us, is this brawl that's happening. Verse 11, two men are fighting, The wife of one draws near to rescue her husband from the hand of him who's beating him, puts out her hand and seizes him by the private parts. Then you shall cut off her hand. Your eye shall have no pity. This is interesting. It's the only punishment in the whole Old Testament that involves some form of bodily mutilation. It's the only one. Which should let us know the severity of what's happening here. And this might be strange to us. Imagine this scenario, but what is being conveyed here is essentially the exact opposite of what was happening under the Levirate marriage situation. In this case, this is a woman who is trying to intervene in the midst of this conflict. It's not saying that this conflict is justified. It's not saying that she shouldn't try and intervene. But when she is defending or attempting to defend her husband, it should never get to the point where she is willing to rob a man of his ability to produce children. It's the exact opposite of the woman whose husband died before he was able to produce children. This lets us know the value of children in this context, and not only in this context, but in life. And we should never be willing to go to such lengths that we would deprive somebody of such an important part of life. And then the last one is the situation with Amalek, killing of the defenseless. And what God encourages his people is to pursue justice on behalf of those who were violently killed by him. So what happened as the Israelites were leaving Egypt and they were fleeing after God had provided them with water from a rock? They were still in the position where they didn't have a reliable source of food or water. They were weary from fleeing the Egyptian army, had been delivered from the Red Sea, and Amalek and the Amalekites, who are named after him, saw this as an opportunity to take advantage. And so they attacked the Israelites, and what had ended up happening is they came in at the end and gathered up all the weak, the feeble, and the frail who were sort of dragging behind. The elderly, the children, people who were disabled. And it was a wicked thing in the sight of the Lord. And so God wants there to be justice done to them because they had violated the dignity of these individuals and done a wicked thing in his sight. He wants their memory to be blotted out. That ends up happening under King David, which shows the idea of sort of the time frame that God is willing to operate in order to bring these things about. But here's what I want you to understand. That when we trust the institutions appointed to us by God to deliver justice on our behalf and our behalf of others who need it, we're supposed to trust in those. That's why they have been appointed. But when they fail to protect or to adjudicate fairly, then we trust God's justice and his perfect timeline. And then lastly, our desire should be for a punishment in proportion to the offense and not the complete degradation of the person. Whether that's beating them, whether that's intervening in the midst of a fight, we should not be so hot with anger that we are willing to go beyond what would be considered a fair consequence for their actions. I won't ask for any hands because I don't want anybody to expose themselves unwillingly. But you've seen the Godfather, right? Most of us have. So at the beginning of the scene at the wedding, and all these people are coming to Don Corleone because he can't refuse a request on the day of his daughter's wedding. And the undertaker comes to him and wants justice for his daughter because these two guys had sort of enticed her, got her drunk, took advantage of her, and did horrible things to her. And Don Corleone says, "What would you have me do?" He says, "I want you to kill him for justice." And he says, "Well, your daughter's still alive. That's not justice." And so then the Undertaker agrees to, "Well, let them suffer as she suffered." It should be common sense to us, right? If it's a common sense to a mobster, that justice is supposed to be proportionate, it should be common sense to us too. But boy, in the heat of the moment, right? We don't want justice. We want them to get it. Whatever can be poured out on them, that's what we want, right? But in that mindset, we begin to not think of them as human beings. We just think of them as objects of our wrath. And our motivations for justice should never go to the point where we don't view humans as humans. We don't view people created in the image of God as people created in the image of God. So these are just examples to us of how God would have his people to love him by loving one another. And for what us, in many cases, is a very sort of strange set of circumstances. Maybe none of these have arisen in our lives. Maybe you've gotten a fist fight with somebody. But this is how God would have his people sacrificed of themselves, motivated by these desires, motivated to meet needs, motivated to live with integrity, motivated to maintain dignity. We have to be very careful with these because we can fall into a very sort of moralistic way of living when we think about applying these types of commands. And it can just become what so many people accuse Christianity of being, and that is just a list of do's and don'ts. We can fall into the same problem that the people of Israel fell into when it came to the law, that they wrongly believed that if they just did the works of the law, they would be considered righteous. You're going to get to this in Romans, I know, because we were talking about it today in my class. And we're a couple chapters ahead of you. So the question is, does the fact that Jesus died on the cross for sins affect in any way how we understand and apply passages like this? Does it help us get beyond just the fact of do this, don't do this? And it does. One, it helps us with motivation. Because the selfless actions of Christ become sort of a model for us. His life, death, and resurrection helps us know what it means to live selflessly, to live humbly, to live for something else. This is how we know what love is. Jesus Christ laid down his life for us. And then John says in 1 John 3:16, and we also ought to lay down our lives for the brothers. It helps us to understand how we should view our own life, how we should view other people. Matthew chapter 7, verse 12, the Sermon on the Mount. So whatever you wish that others would do to you, do also to them, for this is the law and the prophets. This is the golden rule, right? It's another way of saying, love the Lord with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. It's motivation in context of God's generosity to us. It's not motivation in the context of this is how you get God to love you. This is how you get people to think you're a good person. This is how you get people or you become favored in God's sight. No. This is how you show the world that you understand how much God has loved you and why it is you should love him in return. God not only gave us Jesus as an atoning sacrifice for sins, but God also continues to give us innumerable good gifts. And all of this should motivate our conduct towards one another. Not just a simple, do this, don't do this, and then you'll be a good person. That's never God's intent. That was never God's intent when he gave the law originally, and that is certainly not God's intent for us to be obedient to him with a full understanding of what it is he has done for us through Jesus Christ. We do what is right because of what he has done for us. We don't do what is right to try and convince him to love us. Let's pray. Dear Lord, we thank you so much for chapters like this. There certainly are a lot of challenges to simply understand these instructions. And then it's challenging to understand why these instructions were given. And then certainly it is challenging to understand how do these instructions have any bearing on our lives today. We know that you have summed them all up under that umbrella of loving you and loving our neighbors. May we never be so deluded as to think that our ability to do what you have commanded us to do is the basis on which you declare us righteous, or on the basis that others perceive us to be righteous. May we be ready, willing, and eager to declare our own unrighteousness, and be willing to point others to your grace and mercy in our lives as the only basis by which we can stand uncondemned before you. It is the work of Christ on our behalf alone. May that propel us to these other layers of motivation. Motivations to meet needs, motivations to maintain integrity and dignity. May they be the reason why we desire to be obedient. To love you because you first loved us, and to love others because we love you. We ask all this in your name. Amen. All right, would you please stand for our final song and benediction?